And Blanca says, "Is that Dr. Willaims?" So, and it just happened to be playing Trey's guitar in the living room. So, today already I've been confused with Michael Card and Francis Schaeffer. This is going to be a good day. I can tell you that already. We're going to see if we can make this work. First thing up is a slide that gives you my website address. If you want to copy that down, it will take you to my website, which after the FrancisSchaefferStudies.org site is the coolest site on the entire internet and contains all kinds of resources related to my writings, my classes, all kinds of fun stuff. About 10 years worth of sermons actually have been transcribed and put on the site. I get responses from all over the world. I've reached more people with those sermons on the internet than I ever did preaching them to a live audience, which is kind of interesting. So there's all kinds of wonderful stuff there. So let's pause for a second if anybody actually wants to copy that down. And we move on to Schaeffer's Cultural Apologetics and Background and Orientation. This is going to be interesting because normally when I do this I have a clicker that lets me advance the slides, and the next thing that comes up reminds me about what I'm supposed to say. Now, Dan's going to be advancing the slides, and so we'll see how confused I get in the process of giving my own lecture. Hopefully, you'll be a little bit less confused than I am. Let's move on to the next one. The rest of the introductory slides. I think we have a wonderful picture of Schaeffer coming up. I love this one because it really captures how thoughtful and how visionary the man was. This is Schaeffer the way I remember him. I got to meet him on a couple of different occasions, 3 times actually. Twice I skipped classes for a week to go to a Labrie conference at Covenant College. Skipping those classes was the best academic decision I ever made. And then last time was in 1982 when Schaeffer was in his final disease and already very visibly weakened. And he spoke in Athens, Georgia, and spent some time at the church that I was a part of in Athens back then. But who was this guy, Francis Schaeffer? I teach a course that's required of all freshmen at Sequoia Falls College called Humanities 103, Western Thought and Culture. And up till just this year, we switched finally to Nancy Piercy's Saving Leonardo. So we've been using How Should We Then Live as the textbook for that course. I've got 175 freshmen sitting in an auditorium at a Christian college in a course about Francis Schaeffer and his view of how Christian thinking and Western culture have grown side by side and influenced each other. I said, how many of you had never heard of Francis Schaeffer or Labrie before you took this course? And almost every hand in the room went up. Out of 175 Christian college freshmen, only about 5 had heard of Schaeffer before they got to that class. 10 years ago, half of them would know who Schaeffer was. 20 years ago, all of them would have. And so I'm very much became concerned at that point, kind of a wake-up call, that we are letting, as an evangelical movement, we are letting a tremendous treasure that God has given us slip through our fingers because we have not learned the lessons that we ought to have learned from this man. And now, as he recedes into the background, as the current generation of young people don't even know that he ever existed, the opportunity to learn them slips away. So I was very, very excited to discover Dan and this group on the web, and very, very grateful for the opportunity of being here now. Move on to the next. Quotation from the God who is there. True education means thinking by association across the disciplines, not just being qualified in one field. That's one thing Schaeffer stressed all the time, and which my students absolutely lack. You know, they have their minds totally compartmentalized. You know, I'm teaching an English class, and I say, what did you guys learn in hermeneutics that would help us interpret this passage? And they look at me like, you can't do that. That's like letting the food touch on your plate. I mean, that's hermeneutics. That's a Bible class. We can't do that. So in Western thought, what I try to do is take all of those little folders that are never allowed to touch each other and dump them all into one big messy pile in the middle of the floor, and then make them sort through it all again and realize everything is connected. That's one of the main things Schaeffer has to teach us. Let's move on. So who is this guy? Where did he come from? Why is he still important? Schaeffer was born at a very early age, like most of us. In 1912, he was born to parents who were professing Christians, but basically nominal Christians, and he was brought up in a liberal church where people didn't really believe the Bible and where he didn't really hear the gospel. And so there wasn't much there, so as a result, by the time he had reached his teenage years, he'd become an agnostic. In 1930, he was converted by reading the Bible. As a high school student, he decided, well, if I'm going to be an agnostic and not believe in God, at least I ought to understand what I'm not believing in. So for the sake of intellectual honesty, he just got a King James Bible, read it from cover to cover, so he wouldn't be rejecting out of ignorance. And in the process of doing that, he discovered that the Bible had answers to the philosophical questions he was already wrestling with, and by now already realized that secular philosophy had no answers to. The way he describes it is just these individual intellectual problems. It wasn't like the Bible shot them down one by one. It was like he pictured the intellectual problems as like hot air balloons floating in the sky. It wasn't like the Bible shot them down one at a time. It's like it threw a net over the whole lot, pulled them together into one package and put it in his hand. If the infinite personal God is there and created the universe, everything makes sense. If he wasn't, nothing does. And so, by reading the Bible, nobody was witnessing to him. Nobody gave him the four spiritual laws. He read the Bible, concluded that the message of the Bible was true, and believed it, and became a Christian. He thought he was the only one. Because he came from a liberal church where they didn't believe this stuff. He didn't realize there was anybody else. Next date is 1935, where Schaeffer graduated from Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia and married Edith DeVille. Edith was the person, her parents were missionaries in China. She introduced Schaeffer. She was like, wow, there's another one of us. You know, there's another one like me who believes this stuff and takes it seriously. And she introduced him to the whole believing world. He realized there is a world out there of people who are faithful to the Bible, who still believe this stuff, and I need to be part of it. He entered Westminster Seminary that year and proceeded in the next little bit to graduate from there we go. 1938, graduated from Faith Seminary. What is going on here? Well, Schaeffer is moving into what today we would call the evangelical world. It wasn't called that back then. Schaeffer was moving into the believing Christian movement at a time when it was undergoing a very, very significant crisis. Schaeffer became part of what was known at that time as the fundamentalist movement. And in pursuing his training in the believing world, he goes to Westminster Seminary, still one of the great conservative seminaries in this country. But there was a split at Westminster. Some of the Westminster faculty decided that other people there weren't quite conservative enough, or weren't quite hard-nosed enough in their opposition to liberalism, and they left Westminster to form Faith, and Schaeffer went with these guys. So he leaves Westminster, goes to Faith Seminary, and is ordained in the Bible Presbyterian Church, which was a fundamentalist denomination. We already heard mention of them earlier. Okay, in order to... now, why am I pausing so much on this, about Schaeffer switching seminaries? Because Schaeffer is getting involved in the fundamentalist movement in a way that is eventually, I think, going to have a tremendous impact on his understanding of Christian faith and on his understanding of ministry. And Schaeffer is going to learn from his mistakes in this period. To understand what's happening here and why this is important, we need to pause Schaeffer's life, step back, and understand what's happening in the larger history of evangelicalism at this time. So let's take a look at the fundamentalist movement. Fundamentalism was called fundamentalism because it stood for what were called the 5 fundamentals of the faith. At the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, the mainline Protestant denominations in this country were being swept into liberal theology. There were still believing Christians in all of them, but you could no longer trust those churches to ordain Bible-believing people, to send out Bible-believing missionaries, to teach the Bible faithfully in their schools, their seminaries, and a group of faithful Bible-believing people began to say, there's something wrong with this. We have to stand against this movement and stand for the integrity of the church based on the Word of God. They came to be known as fundamentalists because of a series of publications called the Fundamentals that identified 5 fundamental, that means foundational doctrines. A fundamentalist was somebody who believed 2 things. Number 1, he believed that these 5 things were true, but number 2, he also believed that they were essential to faithful Christianity, and that to depart from them was to depart from the Christian faith. And that therefore, organizations putting themselves forth as Christian churches needed to hold to this, and if they didn't, they were apostate. You couldn't really be part of them. What were the 5 fundamentals of the faith? First, the inspiration and inerrancy of the Scriptures. Second, the deity of Christ. Number 3, the historicity of the New Testament miracles, especially the virgin birth and literal bodily resurrection of Christ. It was all the miracles to be accepted, but these 2 became the shibboleths, because pretty much if you accept the virgin birth and the resurrection, it's fairly inconsistent to have a problem with the other miracles. And so if you're going to have a problem with the supernatural nature of Christian faith, it's going to show up at these 2 points. Next comes the necessity of atonement by Christ's blood for sin. And finally, a literal and personal second coming of Christ. They didn't specify that it was pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill, pre-mid, post-trib, but it's not just a spiritual thing, some airy-fairy thing. Jesus is going to keep his promise and come back personally. 5 things, if you believe these things are true, and if you believe they are essential to Christian faith, that you cannot depart from these 5 fundamental doctrines without departing from Christianity, no matter what you call it. You're a fundamentalist. Now, the word fundamentalist has picked up some interesting connotations since this time. And the reason why that happened is exactly the things that Schaeffer was going through in the 30s. This is why we're pausing. So let's move on to the next slide. What's the problem with fundamentalism? Well, the fundamentalist movement included people like B.B. Warfield, people like J. Gresham Machen, people who were very engaged, intellectual people, thinking people. It also included other people who were more inclined to protect this core biblical orthodoxy by withdrawing from society, putting their heads in the sand, and just ignoring the challenges rather than meeting them. Anybody who believed these things and believed that they were important is a fundamentalist, but in that larger movement you have some healthy and some unhealthy ways of pursuing that same sort of goal. The issue that brought to a head this lack of unity within the movement was the issue of separation. Do we leave these mainline denominations that have compromised on the fundamentals of the faith? Must we come out from them and form conservative, faithful, Bible-believing churches? Or is it okay to stay within those liberal and compromised structures and try to work for change from within? Try to be a faithful witness in those liberal church structures. And so the people known as fundamentalists came to a parting of the ways, because some of them said, look, the church is the pillar and support of the truth, according to Paul as he writes to Timothy. You can't be the pillar and support of the truth if you don't believe the truth. So if you can't practice church discipline, and you can't deal with people who don't accept the deity of Christ or the authority of the Scriptures teaching from your pulpits, you can't be part of that. You have to come out. The truth of the gospel trumps everything. And so people left. And the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Bible Presbyterian Church, lots of conservative Baptists, etc., Baptist, Methodist, all the denominations faced these issues, and there were people who left the big mainline groups and formed smaller but faithful denominations or independent churches. Others felt like, God called me to the ministry here. I need to stay here and be a faithful witness where I am. I need to try to work for change and reformation within this church. So the movement begins to split over strategy. Do we stay? Do we leave? Then the people who left had a further difference of opinion. If we left, how do we relate to our fellow fundamentalist brothers in Christ who stayed behind? Okay, so here's this word separation. Separation means we can't be part of this corrupted structure. We have to separate from liberalism. Come ye out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord. So we separate. But not all of the fundamentalists separated. So if we're the separated brethren, how do we relate to people who believe in the fundamentals of the faith who stayed? And so separation means you leave. But then comes along the idea of secondary separation. We not only separate from liberals, we separate from everybody who's not as separated from the liberals as we are. And the people who stayed behind are actually worse than the liberals. They're traitors because they ought to know better. And so the secondary separationists, we not only, primary separation, we separate from liberalism. Secondary separation, we separate from anybody who isn't separated from liberalism. Okay? We can't have fellowship with them as fellow Christians. And the secondary separationists became the group that clung to the name fundamentalist. So that in our time, technically, in church history, a fundamentalist means a secondary separationist who's a fundamentalist. If we go by the original definition, the five fundamentals, I suspect we're all fundamentalists. But Those who held to secondary separation continued to be known as fundamentalists, people like Bob Jones, Carl McIntyre. And those who were not separationists and who were not secondary separationists came to be known as neo-evangelicals, and then the neo was dropped and they just became known as evangelicals. I suspect most of us, like Schaeffer, are separationists but not secondary separationists. We may have some people who are working in the liberal denominations still. I mean, the evangelical movement encompasses all of that. Well, Schaeffer is a young guy, okay? Like many young people, he is very zealous. And he came out of a liberal church. I mean, he knows that that's not Christianity. He can't understand any reason why anybody would have any patience at all with that stuff. And so the secondary separationists, like Carl McIntyre, who founded the Bible Presbyterian Church, they looked to him like the people who were taking the truth of the gospel most seriously. And so that's where he goes. He follows McIntyre into the Bible Presbyterian Church and over to Faith Seminary and out of Westminster, and it seemed like the right thing to do because the truth matters supremely, and these are the people who are willing to give up the most for the truth and to stand for it without any compromise at all. It's easy to understand why Schaeffer would think that way, okay? And we've skipped some of these already, as I figured we would. Yeah, Schaeffer's choices lead to, he began with the Bible Presbyterian Church, which was the hardline secondary separationist. Then he realized he couldn't go along with secondary separation as it was being practiced in that body, and joined the Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod, which later merged with the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, which gives us Tony and Dan. Okay? So at the end of his life, Schaeffer was part of the PCA. Okay? But unmaking that first set of choices was a tremendous crisis that I think left its mark on Schaeffer in such a way that he became supremely an example to all of us of someone who speaks the truth in love. That's hard to do. You know, I find that just using my own natural ability, I can speak the truth. I can defend it. I can kick the butt of the liberals and the atheists. And, you know, but then, does it do any good? But then, okay, well, I'm supposed to speak the truth in love. And we think, well, that needs to be nice. And when you start making being nice your definition, then pretty soon you're into the why don't we all just get along type thing. You know? And so you have the people who focus on love and end up compromising the truth, or the people who hang on to that truth and make it so ugly that nobody's attracted to it. You cannot pull both of those sides of the equation together and speak the truth in love in the power of the flesh. It cannot be done. I'm convinced. I know I can't do it. You've got to have a deep and profound work of the Holy Spirit in your life to have any chance at that. And in order to have that, you have got to be brought to a place of absolute despair about trying to do it any other way. And this is basically what happens to Schaeffer as we come back to the chronology. In 1947, after serving some pastorates in the U.S., Schaeffer traveled to Europe with the Independent Board for Presbyterian Missions, a fundamentalist group, founded, I think, by J. Gresham Machen. 1948, they moved to Lausanne, Switzerland, as missionaries with a group called Children for Christ. Similar to Child Evangelism Fellowship, which some of you may be familiar with. It's kind of ironic to think of Schaeffer beginning his ministry doing child evangelism. When you actually know Schaeffer, it's not ironic at all, but given his later reputation, it's a little bit weird. And we come then to 1951. 1951, a very, very significant year in the history of the church. Two things happened that year. Number one, I was born. Even more significantly than that, Schaeffer goes through a spiritual crisis over the lack of love in the separatist movement. Because these guys were so angry at the people who weren't secondary separationists, felt so betrayed by them. They were not speaking the truth in love. And Schaeffer is looking at the ugliness of all of this, and it bothers him because shouldn't the people who are the most committed to the truth of the gospel, if the gospel is in fact true, shouldn't the people who are the most committed to the truth of the gospel be the people who show the most fruit of Christ-like character and action in their lives? And if they're not, something very, very bad is wrong. How can this be true if it produces such ugliness? And Schaeffer says that he went all the way back to his agnosticism. It started over from scratch. He was walking in the hills of Switzerland when the weather was good. When it was not good, there was a barn that he would pace back and forth in. He worked all this stuff out, and he came to realize, yes, the gospel is the truth of God. It has to be. There is no other truth that is true. But we have to go beyond just speaking the truth to speaking the truth in love. And so, the next year, Schaeffer happens to be on furlough. Not a couple of years later, by 1953-54, Schaeffer is on furlough in the U.S., and like all missionaries on furlough, he goes around to supporting churches to ask for more money. And instead of doing the typical, little missionary report, which would have been, I suppose, with an overhead projector or a slide projector back then, he's preaching these hard-hitting sermons on the need for sanctification, on the need for showing the love of Christ in our ministry, on the fact that we've only got half of what we need in this fundamentalist movement to truly stand for the truth of the gospel. And in these sermons, Schaeffer managed to step on quite a few toes. I mean, how do you tell these people that they're doing it all wrong without that? And consequently, when you step on people's toes, they are less motivated to support your mission. And Schaeffer gets back to Switzerland, and his support all disappeared and dried up because these messages were not terribly well received. So that brings us to 1955. Here they are. Nobody's sending them any money. We're in Europe. We can't do our ministry. We're not supported. Why has God brought us here? What are we supposed to do? And they, as anybody who's read the La Brie story or is familiar with the Schaeffer's ministry knows, out of that despair, they had the little family meeting, and they decided they were just going to trust God. They didn't have a plan. They said, God's brought us here for a reason, so we're just going to trust Him. We're going to radically step out in faith, and we're going to show that God exists. We're going to show it, because if God doesn't exist and God doesn't answer prayer, we're going to die. So if we're still alive, that means God exists. Because we're not going to send out fundraising letters. We're not going to do the standard thing. We're just going to pray and ask God to answer prayer. And we're going to ask God to show us why He's brought us here. And that's what La Brie came out of that decision. It turned out the reason they were there was to demonstrate the existence of God in two ways. First, by giving honest answers to honest questions. Second, by living a life of prayer. In other words, when you went to L'Abri, you heard the answers, but you heard them in a community that was obvious to you couldn't be here if this stuff wasn't true. Because when they had a need, they would pray. God would answer them. It's the combination, really, of three things. The answers. Schaeffer gave good answers. The community, which existed as a practical demonstration of a practical life of faith. And then third was Schaeffer's compassion. That's the word that's used about him a lot. People talk about compassion. Schaeffer learned to speak the truth in love by experiencing the opposite to the point of despairing over his ability to do it in his own strength. And there would have been no L'Abri. We would not be sitting here today thinking about the ministry of Francis Schaeffer had it not been for that moment. We're only about halfway through this presentation, but I am 100% of the way through my time plus. And this is a good place to stop because Schaeffer was constantly telling people, you can't copy L'Abri. You can't just go out and do what we did and expect it to work. It's not a formula. And if we try to do that, we'll fall flat on our faces. We have to come to the place that Schaeffer came to, of truly giving up the idea that we can do this in our own wisdom, we can do this in our own strength, we can do this in a spirituality that isn't radically dependent on a moment-by-moment walk with Christ. It's easy to say those words. You can learn to say those words. That doesn't cost you anything. Oh, this is what we're supposed to say. So that's what you have to come to that place. Until you come to that place, until you come to that place of despair in any other way but God's way, God is so creative and so wonderful and so gracious. He uses us anyway. But he can't use you the way he used Francis Schaeffer until we come to the same place that Schaeffer came to. We don't do it by copying L'Abri. We don't do it. Some of us might be called to do it by starting a study center. Who knows? But I think the bottom line is you've got to have the honest answers to honest questions that are fully faithful to the Bible without compromise. You have to live the life that you're called to live as a practical life of faith. And you have to speak the truth in love. And to do that, you have to die to yourself. There is no shortcut. You've got to go through that darkness to come out into the light. I think too many evangelical Christians simply have not done that. I can't make that happen in your life. Only God can. I pray that it won't take the kind of crisis that it took for Schaeffer. But I know from my own personal experience that we have to come to that place. And if we do, we really will carry on Schaeffer's legacy into the next generation. May God make it so.